Order. Thank you very much indeed for coming in this morning, gentlemen. Mr. Stevens, Mr. Calvert. To this hearing on blood doping. Mr. Stevens, can I just ask you to start by describing the overall context of this, how you came across Dr. Bonner and what your relationship was with him?
Yeah, as an athlete, I was competing regularly. And I'm 40 now. I was having trouble recovering. So a doctor diagnosed me with low testosterone levels. And that's how this started. I generally had a low testosterone level. I think under NHS guidelines I'm able to be prescribed testosterone by the NHS. So there was a legitimate medical reason to use testosterone originally. And I heard about Dr. Bonner through the internet and started working with him, and then he kind of manipulated the situation into potentially using bigger and better things.
Into potentially?
Using stronger substances.
Right.
EPO, for example.
EPO, yeah. What other substances?
He was giving me prescriptions for growth hormone as well.
Prescriptions for
human growth hormone.
For human, thank you. Sorry, I'm struggling slightly to hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
So you contacted him on the internet, or you heard about him via the internet?
Yeah, he advertises himself as an anti-aging doctor who specialises in sort of male hormone replacement therapy, which is, I think from a non-sporting point of view, I don't think there's much wrong with that. I think that's.
Does that have any code meaning inside sports?
Pardon?
Does that have any coded meaning inside sports?
Sorry, can you say that?
Any coded meaning? Does that have any further meaning inside sports? Did you have any reason to think that he might be able to help you with sporting issues?
Yeah, obviously yes. And my issue is that it's kind of a moral grey area, isn't it? As you get older, as a male, you're potentially producing less testosterone, and there's a legitimate reason to use testosterone.
Yes.
And if that's affecting your day-to-day lifestyle, then again there's a legitimate reason to use that.
Yes.
And I think that's the issue when performance-enhancing drugs and drugs that are used for genuine medical reasons are sort of the issue conflicts, doesn't it? Because on one hand, you could be anyone in this panel could be prescribed testosterone today for a genuine, legitimate medical reason. But as an athlete, you're potentially prejudiced against by not being allowed to use that because it could have the potential to improve performance.
Right. So as an athlete, you knew it might improve your performance, but you were really thinking about its medical benefits.
Well, I think as an athlete, it's always had an anti-doping stance, always been against doping. The feeling was that if it's needed for genuine medical reasons, what you're actually doing is returning your levels back to a normal, acceptable level.
Right. So you contacted Dr. Bonner. How did you choose him? How did you know he was the right person to go and see for you as an athlete?
In the same way you choose a dentist, for example, he was pretty much the first guy that came up on Google, and that was that. So he was he marketed himself very well. It was well advertised, and a quick search come up.
Did you get any references from other athletes? Did you consult around?
No, because the issue at the outset wasn't really a sporting issue. Like, the perception that I had was that if a doctor said you needed to take testosterone to restore your levels back to a normal level, within a normal range, then that wasn't cheating. And
a regular hospital consultant could do that, could they not?
Potentially, yeah. Problem is, I'm busy, and
so
I was a busy person, and
right.
I was able to, use the services of a private practitioner.
Right. And where did you meet Dr. Bonner?
In his NHS clinic in Connaught Square. So at the time, he was working for the NHS.
Right.
And he had a clinic in Connaught Square, which was an NHS clinic. So I met him in an NHS clinic as a private patient.
And how often did you see him?
5 or 6 times, maybe 7 times.
Over a period
it
of...
may have been,
Over a period of...
A year?
A year.
Okay. And you started off with testosterone.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
He started trying. He suggested using other substances, and at the front, at the initial meetings, I was against it. My perception at the time was I was there for a genuine medical reason. I was struggling to recover.
Sure.
A doctor who worked for British Cycling originally told me that I had the issue with testosterone. Fortunately, that doctor is in the Midlands, so it wasn't very practical to see him. He was a private doctor as well. And what started with an understanding that it was for genuine medical reasons, then escalated from there. Right. And I felt very much that the doctor was trying to manipulate me into using stronger substances by telling me that other athletes were using it and it was common practice.
He knew you were an athlete.
Yeah, he knew I was an athlete. Yeah, because
he compared your performance to other athletes.
Yeah.
He compared your performance to what it could be if you took these additional substances.
Yeah. So the initial issue was lack of recovery, just day-to-day fatigue.
Right.
Not feeling myself, just as an individual. Sure. And that was obviously having an effect on my performance as an athlete, because my recovery has been impaired.
And what was the first thing he tried to push you towards?
From the outset, it was always EPO.
EPO,
yeah.
Right. And you then took some on his suggestion?
Yeah, and it took some months to cross that line, and it took some convincing from him to me.
Because that clearly wasn't about recovery, that was about,
but
it was clearly not, it was a sporting desire on your part rather than a medical need.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think the way looking back now, the way I felt was, like anyone that becomes a victim of people selling drugs, there's an element of that person trying to push it onto you because they want a client.
You thought he was a kind of pusher in a way.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so.
And you were paying him for this advice.
Yeah.
And he was giving you prescriptions.
Yeah.
Which you then used at what kind of a chemist? A specialist
Just a
chemist?
high street chemist.
A high street chemist.
Yep.
You can buy EPO through a high street chemist.
With a prescription, yeah.
Okay. You then went on to other potential forms of performance enhancing substance?
Not necessarily. He gave me prescriptions for growth hormone. He gave it to me just in case I wanted to use it, and that was never prescribed.
Right.
Which is why UCAD were given prescriptions for those products.
Right. So the situation was that you had not specifically asked for human growth hormone or anything like that. He had suggested it. You had said, well, I'm not sure about that. He said, look, have some prescriptions anyway. And then because you hadn't redeemed those, you were able then to hand them over to UK anti-doping.
Yeah.
Were there any other drugs involved?
There was thyroxine, vitamins, B12.
They aren't performance enhancing. No. They're not regarded as
iron.
Right.
Obviously, if you use an EPO, your body needs iron to produce red blood cells.
Right.
So iron supplements help.
That's the natural counterpart to using EPO on an EPO regimen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And how long did you use that with him?
A period of 3 months, so it was quite a short period.
And you noticed it had effects on you?
Yeah, huge effects. Yeah, 15 to 20% performance gain.
That was in line with what he predicted, was it?
Pretty much, yeah.
And he measured the performance improvements with you, or you saw them in your own?
I train with power, so all of my training files were based on power. And if you train with power and you measure in watts, power output in watts, it's quite easy to see the gains. So I saw an increase of probably 60 or 70 watts at my threshold power, which is massive.
Did you have any side effects from these prescriptions?
No.
You were taking the supplements as suggested, iron, etc.
Yep, no side effects.
Okay, so talk then about what happened. You became uncomfortable about this situation.
Yeah.
Then what did you do?
I had an out-of-competition test from UCAD. I think they'd obviously found out what was happening. I think maybe another athlete had told them they'd seen big performance gains, and I refused to provide a sample, and then agreed to meet with UCAD In fact, I asked for the meeting. They didn't ask me to give them information. It was me that volunteered.
Event?
No. In any
we're
testing
talking-
in any
how
way,
old-
shape or form.
How old were you at this point?
I've been competing as an athlete since I was 13 and a half.
Right, and you were what, 38 at this point or something?
I'm 40 now.
Yeah, but when
38 at
is-
that point, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
So I've competed at a high county level.
So you've had 25 years
Yeah,
of competition.
yeah,
You've never
yeah.
seen UCAD at
Yeah.
any county
So I
level.
think obviously UCAD have only been in existence for
No,
the
but
last
other
few years.
anti-doping authorities or any
Yeah,
other
whether it's
test.
Sport England or anyone, I've never seen any.
So you have the test. Did you? At what point did you approach them?
I think the test was in. I think it was 3 months after the test, so around about March time.
So you had the
March.
response back at that point,
Yeah.
had you?
Yeah.
And you said, actually, I'd like to raise something.
Yeah. I had a letter that stated there was a case to answer, and on receipt of that, I instructed a solicitor. The solicitor organised a meeting for me with UCAD. At the time, I felt that UCAD were very reluctant to listen to my information, and I spent quite a lot of time pursuing UCAD as to why they hadn't, in my opinion, done a thorough investigation.
Who did you see at UCAD?
Head of legal, Graham Arthur, was one of the people I was dealing with. I think at the time in the meetings it was Pat Mayhill, Graham Simpson and Stacey Shelville.
Right, so 4 people,
Or senior people.
senior people.
Yeah.
You raised these issues with all of them.
Raised the issues of all of them, every single one of them. Over 3 meetings. Well, there's 3 transcribed meetings.
There are 3 transcripts.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
So I
you
did have
transcri-
one. So
there are transcriptions of the meetings.
yeah.
You then follow up by giving them. Do you give them prescriptions at this point?
Yep. So I gave UCAD information relating to Dr. Mark Bonner with copies of prescriptions, and Graham Arthur, who at the time was the head of legal for UCAD, said that information is of little to no use to UCAD.
As per the transcript you've got.
No, as per the prescriptions. So I gave Graham Arthur, head of legal, copies of prescriptions
Signed
from
by Dr. Bonner.
Signed by Dr. Bonner, prescribed in
for
high street chemists.
human growth hormone.
For human growth hormone, for EPO, for testosterone, that could have been prescribed in any British chemist in the country. And his response was that is of little to no use.
And that was in an email, wasn't it?
That was an emailed response.
Well, I want to come in a second if I may. I just want to get the exact situation that you've had then, Mr. Stevens. So it was then at that point that you ran out of patience with UKAD, is that
No,
right?
no. That comment was made in an appeal process. So I appealed my case on the basis that my appeal was concerned with the conduct of UCAD. That's why I appealed my case. So my appeal process was very much based on the fact that as an athlete, I've provided substantial assistance under Rule 10.52 of the WADA Code. That rule says that if an athlete provides information that leads to the discovery of a criminal act, an anti-doping rule violation, or the breach of professional body rules, that athlete should be given a reduction of anything up to 75% of the applicable sanction. So my appeal was based on the fact that I ticked all 3 of those boxes through information I provided to UCAD, some of which obviously can't be disclosed in this forum. And yet, in spite of doing that, I received no reduction from UCAD. And my view is that very much contradicted the case against Armstrong, where Hincapie, Leipheimer, etc. were given a 75% reduction for information that was, yes, it was against a larger, more well-known athlete, but the actual category of information wasn't any different. And my view is that all athletes, compete under the same WADA code, and there shouldn't be any variations in how information is treated based on the celebrity status of an athlete.
So you only had a reduction, in your view, of 3 months from 24 to 21 months?
From under the WADA code,
Right.
under the UK anti-doping rules, I had no reduction. The Cycling Independent Reform Commission gave me the reduction, and UCAD reluctantly honoured that reduction. So even in spite of me meeting the Circ and the Circ wanting to give me a reduction, UCAD tried to stop me receiving the benefit of that reduction as well.
Why do you think UCAD was unwilling to offer you the 75% reduction that had been the norm for other whistleblowers?
Do you want my brutally honest opinion?
Of course.
Graham Arthur just didn't like me.
Right, so it was a personal thing between
Yeah.
you and a senior member of UCAD,
Yeah.
the legal counsel.
Yeah.
Did you feel at any point that they were soft peddling the results in order to protect themselves in some way?
What I found difficult with UCAD was an event that I recommended they should test at was posted on Twitter 2 days before they were due to test at the event. UCAD posted on Twitter that they would be testing at the event. So I gave an intelligence-based organisation intelligence that an athlete who is doping would be racing at an event, and that intelligence was, posted on Twitter 2 or 3 days before the event.
So they effectively deliberately gave notice to any athletes who might have been competing at that event that they
It
were
could
going
be
to
seen that way, yeah. So
And
my concern was not, and is, not whether there's whether testing's effective. My concern is whether there's a desire to deliver effective testing.
Right.
So UCAD are an intelligence-based system operation using £6 million of public sector money, I believe. I gave them intelligence. They published that intelligence in effect on Twitter 2 or 3 days before they were due to target test an athlete.
I don't understand that, but UCAD constantly does unannounced testing in out of
UCAD assured me that they would
competition
not.
and also in competition context. So why is that? How could that happen?
Don't know. That's why
Okay.
we're here, I gather.
So at what point do you then approach the Sunday Times?
After I'd agreed with my sanction, because obviously I've agreed. We agreed a decision through my legal counsel and UCAD, and I agreed that on the basis that UCAD were telling me the truth. I very much feel that decision I made in a legal forum was done on the basis of false pretense that I don't believe UCAD at the time were telling me the truth. I believe that I made a decision in a legal forum to accept the sanction based on information that simply wasn't true.
What were they telling you that was untrue?
So I was told that they had done a thorough investigation into Dr. Bonner. Some of the other information I can't obviously disclose for legal reasons here. But I had a number of concerns that I was being coerced and misled into what had happened with the information that I provided. The simple point for me was that I don't believe any of the information was investigated properly, and I don't believe there was any desire to actually follow up the information I provided, and I don't believe there was a genuine attempt made to use that information to catch athletes. And as an athlete who signed up to the Wilder Code, and under that code, you give away quite a large proportion of your legal rights, and you're forced into appealing it in the National Anti-Doping Panel. It becomes quite a difficult forum to kind of, investigate what has been going on.
I mean, I take the point you make, we take the point you make. It seems to me, just in relation to what we're talking about now, that you're saying that the fact that, as you saw it, you were severely misled, was additionally difficult for you because you had less recourse than someone would be because you'd signed up to all these other rules. Is that the point you're making?
Yeah, I believe that if I was litigating that situation in a civil court or even a criminal court, my rights for disclosure would have been far greater.
And that's why it would be better, in your view, to make this a criminal offence.
Yeah, and I think one of the drivers for me is the case of Steve Mullins. Steve Mullins has made allegations that he believes his test sample that Jamaican Athletics took in some way was spiked. So he's asked WADA to allow him to DNA test his own sample. WADA won't let him. He's banned for life. He believes his test sample has been spiked. He wants it DNA tested, and he's being refused.
Okay.
And I think in a criminal court, that just wouldn't happen.
You'd have more recourse.
So I believe athletes would
So the sentence gets handed down, and at that point you come to the view that inadequate redress has been had, and you go to the Sunday Times.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you want to comment on this, Mr. Calvert? How your experience was of this? Whether aspects of what Mr. Stevens has said that you think need to be highlighted or supplemented?
Well, when he came to us, it was quite obvious to us that there was he'd given UK quite a lot of information, but there was one standout fact in that he'd obviously been treated by a private doctor in London who had also told Dan at some point that he was treating other athletes. It seemed to us that seemed to be a focus for the investigation, and we've seen all the interviews that Dan did with UK. There were 3, and Dan gives them lots of information, and they never quite hone in on Dr. Boner. They ask bits and pieces, questions around it, but they never drill in on the facts. And one of the things that Dan had said to us was that he'd offered to go undercover with Dr. Boner, so go back and wear a microphone or whatever, just to get the proof that they needed, and they wouldn't do that. We don't know why.
That's true, is it, Mr. Stevens?
Yeah, I basically said I'm at your disposal. You know, I'm an athlete that believes in clean sport.
Sure.
I feel like I've met this doctor and he's coerced me into
this
said, situation.
Yeah.
I do everything. You know, other athletes shouldn't be exposed to the same situation.
And what have they said to you?
Nothing really. They just shrugged the whole thing off. There was no attempts to really follow
So, Mr. Calvert, you've got a situation here in your view where Mr. Stevens has offered himself essentially to gather specific information about this person. There's a suggestion that this is a very experienced prescriber of performance-enhancing drugs, not just to him but to other athletes, and nothing is happening.
And nothing's happening, yes. So as a result of that, what we did was we decided to send a young athlete undercover into Dr. Boner's surgery. By then he had moved to the Omnia clinic in Kensington. He had previously had a clinic on Harley Street as well as his NHS clinic. And we gave the athlete the similar story to Dan. Basically, he was tired, not recovering from his training, and I think it's probably within about 5 minutes of the athlete being in there that Dr. Boner started to talk about the fact that he could offer him performance-enhancing drugs and how that he'd used them on other athletes. And you know, there was a risk involved because you might get caught by the testers, but if you used microdoses, then therefore you probably wouldn't get caught as long as you were doing them, say, off season at times when you weren't like.
This is all on the transcript that you've
And
got.
this is all in the transcript, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it seemed to us immediately that here was a doctor who was talking quite openly about doping athletes. Over the course of 2 or 3 sessions with Dr. Boner, he prescribed, or was willing to prescribe EPO, a human growth hormone, and testosterone, and an array of drugs. I mean, he showed an extraordinary knowledge of the types of drugs you could use. So much more so than just a medical man who knows all about drug prescription. I mean, he had a streetwise attitude to it, which was that he'd obviously been reading a lot on the internet. He'd obviously talked to other sports people about what sort of drugs to use. So for example, he would recommend a drug that was for diabetes for what he called cutting athletes, and by cutting what he meant was cutting excess fat off them. I mean, these are already very lean people, but he was suggesting that they could be, half a stone.
Cutting is a term of art within that particular part of athletics.
Yes, yeah, and this is it's a term he uses.
It's a street language.
Yeah.
To establish a rapport with an athlete.
Yes, exactly. And And so he showed this. He showed a vast knowledge of an array of drugs that you could use. Dan mentioned thyroxine, which is, again, it's a drug that's used to cut fat, and all are banned. And he didn't seem to have any qualms about this whatsoever. I mean, in fact, his view on it was that all athletes were on drugs. He'd never met a clean athlete, and therefore the only real solution was that drugs should be made legal, and drug taking in sport should be accepted as long as it was, and as long as the drugs were administered by a proper professional such as himself.
At appropriate.
As appropriate, yeah.
Fees.
Yeah.
Yes.
So as a result of that, we then sent a reporter in pretending to be his uncle, and to get him talking more about the athletes he was dealing with and what sort of things he was doing, and which is where he told us that he'd previously treated 150 athletes over a 6-year period. He named a number of athletes, and he named a number of sports, so football, cricket, cycling.
You've
boxing.
mentioned various football clubs.
Sorry?
Mentioned various football clubs?
Yes, he's specifically mentioned 4 football clubs, and the players there. And so
the specific players, I mean, because I think the ones that have come into the public array have been Arsenal, Chelsea, Leicester and Birmingham, is that right? And you're saying there are specific footballers at those clubs that he identified as having worked with him?
Yes. And so as a result of all of that, we carried on with them for a little while and probably met him, I don't know, I guess probably about 6 or 7, 8 times, as to establish his credibility. Our pretext was that we were not only wanted this particular athlete to be doped, but we were going to bring a team of athletes to him to be doped ahead of the Olympics. And he was particularly keen to do that, and was suggesting all sorts of ways that we could do it. And as a result of it, he kind of brought in other practitioners. So there was his colleague at the clinic, a man called Peter Cox, who's the nutritionist.
Also at the Omnia Clinic?
At the Omnia Clinic, yeah.
Omnia have said they have no relationship or knowledge of this, whatever, but you're suggesting that actually there was more than one person at the clinic, and therefore there was possibly an institutional aspect to this.
Well, I think the clinic themselves said they had no knowledge, and I think, but what happens is the practitioners come, and whether they're part of the clinic or whether they're freelance is difficult to know. So it's quite possible the clinic didn't know. And so the nutritionist, we talked about the drug program we were going to use, and he was giving us advice on not taking the athletes to too high levels of drug abuse so that they wouldn't get caught by the testers. He also, when we took an interest in the footballers that he'd used, he introduced us to a former fitness coach at Chelsea, who was a friend of his, who talked about working with him on clients in the past, and corroborated the fact that Dr. Bonner had doped several footballers in the past.
Okay, so this is an astonishing catalogue of
yeah.
potential history and behaviour.
Yeah.
Final question I want to pass over to colleagues. Mr. Stevens, you say you originally prescribed EPO when he was at this clinic, his NHS clinic, is that right?
Yeah.
So this was a doctor acting from an NHS facility,
Yes.
providing you with a performance-enhancing drug,
Yeah.
which you can buy at prescription rates from any chemist in the country. Yeah. Thank you. Ian Lucas.
Mr. Stevens, can I take you back to the first time that you met Dr. Bonner, or one of the early times that you met Dr. Bonner? And you've been an athlete for how long by that time?
Most of my life.
And you said that you'd never taken performance-enhancing drugs at that time. And he said to you at some stage that you should take performance-enhancing drugs. That was a massive step for you to make that decision at that time. So why, at that time, before you took any performance-enhancing drugs, why didn't you seek advice at that point from someone about that discussion?
I think for me, a lot of the stuff I've seen going on in competition recently, it's very apparent that there's an endemic doping problem, whether that's at the highest level or at a very low level as well. And I think my opinion was obviously changing at the time as well. You could say that I was more vulnerable by the time I started, that I'd met Dr. Bonner. And I think that's how a lot of athletes in the UK generally feel at the moment, that there is an endemic problem. There's very little testing being done. And I think the saying is, if you can't beat them, join them. And there seems to be a problem that's increasing, especially in gyms as well in the UK. It's very easy to...
So, bearing in mind you'd been cycling for an awful long time, and this was a massive step, did you discuss it with anyone?
No.
So you made the decision to cheat without discussing it with anyone?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Andrew Bingham.
Where do we start? The Dr. Boner is known as Dr. Dope. You said on the cycling circuit. Do you know any other cyclists that have reported him for supplying performance?
Not that I've got suspicions, but I can't clarify that.
Right, and similarly, is he seen by other people in cycling as somebody who should be avoided because of this?
I would assume so now. One thing I will point out is that he isn't an isolated case. There are a number of doctors working from anti-aging clinics doing the same thing. At two more sophisticated levels as well.
What age were you when you went to see Dr. Boner?
38.
38. So I'm just trying to explore a little bit, because I'm greatly concerned about the level of doping that goes across a whole range of athletics. And is this something that we've no idea how endemic it is? And from what you've said to me, you decided to, as Mr. Lucas has just said, effectively decided to take a decision to cheat, which I know sounds harsh, but it's a fact. Was it a case of, I'm 38, I can see other cyclists, I know it's happening, and you can't beat them, so join them? And at 38,
absolutely.
you probably realise this is your last chance to
I think
step up a level.
There's another sort of dimension to that as well. I think when you've been competing as an athlete for 38, you kind of know what your peers are doing and whether they're training regularly, how much talent they've got, and you start seeing people making quantum leaps for no real reason. They're still working, they've still got a family. In some cases, they've got less time available to train, but more time available, more funds available to cheat, and they're making these big gains. It becomes fairly obvious. I think the icing on the cake for me, in terms of that opinion, I suppose, is actually having done it. Having done it, you really do see how big the gains are. And having spent a lot of time playing around with different diets and different training techniques and different programs and different equipment and everything else that's available out there, that make very marginal gains in your performance. I think when you see the effects that doping has, and they are massive gains, it becomes fairly apparent what's going on. And I think that's one of the issues for a lot of athletes who have doped, or have got friends that have doped, or contacts that have doped. It becomes so obvious that in some instances is what needs to be done. And I think that's going down through the ranks as well. I certainly don't think doping starts when you become a professional athlete, because you're potentially not going to become a professional athlete if the amateur athletes are doping. Where does the problem start?
So you're almost saying that you get to a level as an amateur, and to step up that extra level, that if everybody else is doing it, then you've almost got to do it to compete.
I think where we're at as a society now is that if you go into a gym and instruct a personal trainer to work with you, within 2 or 3 sessions with that personal trainer, you may be offered clenbuterol, thyroxine, testosterone. Just as an amateur athlete, not even an amateur athlete, just as an unlicensed athlete trying to get in shape in a gym. And if the problem starts, before people are becoming athletes, I think it gives a good indication of how endemic the issue could be from a bottom-up point of view.
Just a question, Mr. Calvert. You were talking about you sent a reporter in under a cover story of looking to enhance their performance and maybe bring in others. And Mr. Bonner was saying that he could do this, he could do that, do the other. Did he? I mean, you can't name names so much here, but did he give you evidence? Was there an element, do you think, of him just showboating and basically trying to big himself up as to what he could do, or do you think he?
Well, I think, quite clearly what he had done with both Dan and the cover athlete that we sent in there was he had prescribed all sorts of banned drugs for sports performance reasons. He showed an unusual knowledge, and he talked about such a breadth of different sports and athletes that we were pretty convinced that he had done what he said he had done. Now, within all of that, whether there was an element of exaggeration as well, that's possible. But we're pretty sure that this was a doctor who had quite a lot of sports clients.
And from what you said, he was equally as adept. His knowledge was equally great, not only of which drugs to prescribe for what, but how to get away without being caught as well. He seemed to have as much knowledge in avoiding detection as he did in the request.
Yes, he did, and he was there. He was willing to give advice on how quickly you could come off these particular drugs, etc., and how I mean, the scheme he was offering us was he was saying, well, we'll dope for a certain period, and then we'll have a cooling off period so that when you're tested, you won't get caught. But the problem with a lot of these drugs anyway is that if you take EPO, you can take it at 11 o'clock in the evening, and by the time you wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning, it will be out of your system. They are very, very difficult to detect.
It's a fairly sorry picture that you both paint, and it strikes me from what Mr. Stevens has said that you can try, train, no matter how much ability you've got. You're almost saying that actually, unless you're prepared to take performance-enhancing drugs, you are never going to match.
No, and it is a very sorry state of affairs. I think, as Jonathan said, you could take EPO at 7 o'clock at night and be clean by the morning. And obviously, if you're an endurance athlete, EPO is going to be the product you would use to increase your hematocrit level and carry more oxygen around your blood. And I think you mentioned it's a sorry state of affairs. It gets worse. When you look into some of the detail of sanctioned athletes, and you look at, one athlete in particular that was competing in the Tour of Britain in 2012, which is obviously an endurance event, the main substance that would be used for an endurance athlete at that event would be EPO. But yet UKAD make it very clear that at that event, in spite of testing an athlete 4 times in the event, none of those tests actually looked for EPO. So UKAD were testing it.
This is a public documented fact.
Yeah.
So who's the athlete?
Jonathan Tiranok. If you read Jonathan Tiranok's sanction, UKAD confirm in that sanction that they tested him 4 times at the Tour of Britain and never once ran a test for EPO.
Although anyone who'd known the situation would have naturally thought of that first and regarded it as potentially endemic in the sport.
Yeah, and bear in mind, at the same time, the whole Lance Armstrong scandal was unravelling. Sure. So even if they were very naive, which you'd expect UK anti-doping wasn't naive, I think that's well documented that they're not, you would certainly expect them to be testing for EPO in the race on the race leader of the Tour of Britain, especially given the fact that it was Olympic year and we had a huge anti-doping laboratory in Brentwood funded by GSK. So there's no reason to not test for EPO in 2012 at the Tour of Britain.
I think there's a fear of if it was all discovered in its full entirety, as you've suggested today, that it would create such a scandal, it would kill the sport, and that is the fear of finding out the truth.
Yeah, and I think the word kill is relevant for another reason as well. I think, anti-doping exists because of the danger that some of these products represent. If the doping problem is endemic, why are we, and it's fairly apparent that it is endemic, where are all the deaths?
Where are all the
deaths? Where are lots of athletes dropping dead? Where's the evidence for the health problems? If you've got an endemic doping problem, which is fairly apparent, why are we not seeing endemic health problems off the back of that?
Have you got an answer to that question?
No, I don't know.
You're suggesting that the health scares are overdone.
I don't know. I'm suggesting that the whole programme needs to be reviewed from the bottom up. You know, and I think the main issue with anti-doping is obviously misrepresentation. You know, athletes shouldn't be, you know, gaining financially off the back of their performance when they're meant to be competing clean. But it's fairly apparent that not many athletes are potentially competing clean. So where does that leave, you know, the anti-doping industry as such? And I think it's something that needs to be looked at. If it is, you know, if doping should be banned because of the health reasons, then fine. But if it's an endemic doping problem, why are we not seeing lots of endemic health problems?
So your concern about the doping is more the health problems of the people who are taking them over the. I'm sorry, I'm not.
There's potential.
You're saying that there's no health problems, so why does the doping exist? But on the other hand, you're saying the doping does exist.
Yeah, it's a contradiction as such. You know, the issue is, where is anti-doping going in society as you know, at large? Should the rules be different for certain athletes? You know, certain athletes are certainly being prejudiced against because of their situation.
So would you allow doping?
So
if you were in charge, would you allow doping and say,
no, absolutely not. But I think there's some moral issues around the use of some substances. For example, if you are an age group athlete and you are struggling with low testosterone levels, you're effectively disadvantaged. And the Wilder Code places you into a position where you're not able to return them to normal levels. So arguably you're being discriminated against. But then on the other hand, athletes are abusing the TUE programme to effectively, you know, be allowed to use certain products because they're able to get a therapeutic use exemption note for it. So my view is that anti-doping at large is at a bit of a crossroads. I think the problem is fairly obviously endemic and quite large, and obviously there's not enough resources to test every athlete who's competing at every event.
Okay, so just to pick up a couple of things there, did I hear you right when you said, you were essentially suggesting that it was impossible to be a professional cyclist now without some form of doping?
I think you know, you've only got to look at the media to realise that there's obviously a large-scale doping problem and lots of professional athletes.
Right, there's been a huge amount of cleaning up going on in cycling, right?
I'd hope so. Yeah, I hope so. It certainly looks that way, and I think cycling as a sport is doing a lot more than in most other sports.
Okay, and what about amateur cycling? You were suggesting there's quite a lot of doping going on in amateur cycling.
I can't comment on how much doping is going on, because I don't know factually. But all I can tell you is there's not a lot of testing going on in amateur cycling. Right. And when testing is happening, the athletes have been given advance notice that they're going to be tested.
Right. But athletes are microscopically aware of things that make differences to their performance and where they fit relative to other athletes.
Yeah.
So there must be quite a clear understanding within the fraternity or the sorority as to who's doping and who isn't, because you see these extraordinary gains.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Final question, then I want to move to Damien Collins, which is, are you identifying a grey area here where if you can go to someone and say, I have a medical need, they can more or less give you any performance-enhancing drug in the cause of that medical need?
I think that comes back down to TUEs. And if an athlete can can qualify for criteria that allows them to use a TUE.
TUE is a therapeutic use exemption.
Yeah. So that there are potentially situations where athletes can abuse the TUE process.
Or pretend they're doing it in speaking to some doctor who might give them a performance-enhancing drug.
Yeah, agreed. And this is where I was at the very outset. Because the doctor had told me that I need a prescription for these drugs, I assumed that was fine.
Sure. Okay.
But that really isn't the case. And I think that there's educational issues around that. And I think some athletes have been caught doping that were doping without really the intention of cheating. They were just using it to, for lifestyle issues, to return their health back to where they would want it to be.
Okay, that's interesting. Damien Collins.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stevens, you talk about this in a very matter-of-fact way. Is that because you've had time to get used to it, or was it a fairly matter-of-fact business?
Yeah, I think probably both. I think it's probably because I've had time to get used to it. yeah, and it's, you know, I personally feel quite passionate about it because I don't really know where it's going as a whole, the anti-doping environment, where are WADA taking it long term. It's very clear that a lot of people are doping. It's very clear there aren't resources to catch everyone. So do we carry on pretending it is going on or not going on, or what do we do? And I think that's the fundamental point in this kind of forum, is of what do you do? You know, and where is it going, and how sustainable is it in its current format, and how applicable are the rules? You know, both now and moving into the future as well.
But do you think that doping, if an athlete is doping, as long as they don't abuse it, use these stimulants excessively, that they can largely get away with it undetected?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the work you've done with the doctor as well shows that there's obviously a situation where he believes he can help athletes get away with that as well.
And from your own example, I mean, do you think that is typical amongst athletes, say, of your age, who people are trying to sustain a level of performance that age and sort of fatigue is sort of makes it harder for their body to sustain?
Yeah, I think we're definitely in societies in a place where, you know, people are living longer. Some pharmaceutical agents allow people to live healthier lives and can do things they were potentially not able to do 10 years ago. And some of those products fall under banned substances under the WADA code.
But do you think for athletes as they enter their sort of mid-late 30s who are still competing, that actually the in-sport sanctions against doping are not really very compelling, because they're doing it to enable to carry on competing? If they didn't use these substances, they wouldn't be able to compete anymore, and if they get caught, then they get banned. So what's the difference?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of doping. There's a lot of sanctions that have been published for age group athletes. So there's clearly a doping problem in age group competition. But yet at the same time, there's a recent case of a young lad in Britain that was using EPO, and I think he was 16, 17. So there's questions there about how did he get it, where did he get it from, who was supporting him, who was educating him on it, and also who funded that.
Do you just have a sense of education? Do you think there is a knowledge gap here? I mean, from the way you described your own case, the way you present it, to me sounds like because you're given a prescription to go to a chemist to get these substances, how they can't be that harmful. Otherwise, you couldn't be prescribed them.
Yeah, they could. You could go to your local NHS doctor with ADHD and be given a prescription for ADHD medicine, which is effectively an amphetamine. Believing that you can't concentrate at work, you just need to do your job properly, but that falls under the WADA codes as a banned product. So unless you're educated on what those products actually are, you may inadvertently foul a drug test and be classed as a drug cheat, when actually you're just a middle-aged guy trying to do your job and you didn't realise that product was banned. And also that product isn't really improving your performance.
You're right, you still have an obligation.
Absolutely, to know the rules.
To work out what the rules are and know what the rules were.
Yeah. But that athlete could have been competing in his first ever event after he's lost 2 or 3 stone. And his modus operandi is not to cheat, it's just to be healthy and fit, and he's been railroaded into a competition by a couple of his mates at the pub. So would that athlete go through the WADA code in that much detail? There's potentially people around the table now that would fail a doping test. For any number of products you could have taken, whether it's in a Beecham's powder or and you may, if you had the misfortune of being tested at an event, you may fail and then be classed as a drug cheat. Obviously, no one's cheating. It was just So I think there's levels that the rules should apply to, and I think there needs to be more of a view on things. And I think criminalising doping maybe puts the scale of cheating in a different perspective. Like, why is that person cheating, and what's the end result of that? Yeah. What are they trying to gain? Is it financial gain? If the result of you cheating is that you sign a sports contract for £3 or £4 million versus an age group athlete that's done his second or third competition, is just so happens he's been tested, and there's a big difference in gain in that situation. financially.
Yeah.
So should the rules be applied at different, should there be a different system?
Yeah. But do you think if there were criminal sanctions that people would take the issue more seriously?
I think it'd certainly be more deterrent. I certainly think if athletes were appealing their sanctions and reviewing the conduct of the authorities, doing the testing and applying those sanctions, that the athlete would be treated more fairly. From my personal experience, my situation would have been very, very different in terms of me litigating that in a civil court, for example, or dealing with it in a criminal court.
I'm going back to my first question about the sort of matter-of-fact nature of this. I mean, I appreciate as you said, you've had time to get used to it, but the way you describe this, I mean, it just sounds like a kind of just an extension of people's training regimes. I mean, it's just kind of it's part of the business of being an elite sportsman or being an amateur operating at a very senior level within a sport.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Do you feel that, based on your experience, that the way in which the rules are currently constituted, the way UK anti-doping works with athletes that come forward, that it is inhibiting people coming forward with knowledge they have about the extent of doping within sport?
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you look at my situation, if there's any other athletes now that have got information that they wanted to share, would they feel comfortable giving that to UCAD at the moment, given what I've just said? That's certainly my view at the moment. If I could wind the clock back, would I help UCAD? No.
What change? I mean, if it was down to you, what changes would you like to see in the way UCAD works, or the way the WADA code is?
I think from my point of view,
the WADA code,
from my point of view, given at UCAD, there's obviously staffing issues. Graham Arthur's point is that a doctor writing prescriptions out for EPO is of little to no use to UCAD. If that isn't of use, what is?
That's an astonishing view, isn't it, actually?
Yeah, absolutely. That was
who appears to all appearance to be a professional prescriber of performance-enhancing drugs to athletes. How can that not be of direct interest, in the starkest possible terms, to UK anti-doping?
Absolutely. Yeah. And if that isn't, what is?
Yeah. So I was just briefly, to wrap up for me, Jonathan Calvert, I mean, you have extensive experience in sports investigations. I mean, it always strikes me that people get caught out when what they're doing has become so routine that they don't really recognise any particular dangers. Is that your impression of Dr. Bonner and his practice?
Yeah, I think that people aren't being caught out very often. That's part of the problem. I think there's a big arms race in doping, in which the athletes are way ahead of all the scientists. It's quite hard to actually catch people, and so. I mean, we did last year. We had this big file of blood files which showed the huge numbers of athletes who had abnormal blood levels, which suggested either blood transfusions or EPO use. And I think what we're finding more and more is that the drug problem in sport is endemic, and I just don't think that we are, the UCAD or any other doping authorities, set up to tackle that problem.
But it also strikes me that from the different investigations, and many of them that you've been involved with, that what you're actually exposing is information that's always been held within the sport itself, that's always been accessible by the authorities, should they have chosen to go after it.
Yeah, there's always with scandals. It's always the case that it's sort of underneath the surface. It's always been acceptable between all the participants who see other people doing it. They do it. They actually almost think it's okay to do it. And it's only when this is brought to light that suddenly everyone says, "Oh God, this is horrific." And it is a fair point.
But it also seems not the attitudes of the athletes, but the sporting bodies themselves and the other investigatory bodies that are set there to police them. They only seem to feel that they have to act based on the information they have when they're publicly embarrassed and shamed into doing so.
Yeah, and I think this case shows quite clearly that they're not very proactive. If you're, with this particular case, obviously they should have investigated Dr. Bonner. They didn't even pick up the phone to him. They didn't send him a letter or anything. And by their own admission, they should have then passed the information on to the General Medical Council because there is a provision within the code which says that doctors are not allowed to prescribe performance-enhancing drugs. They didn't do that, and we really don't know why. And I think kind of generally, I think there has been a complacent attitude towards doping in sport. It's, you know, sport's now big business. If you start exposing your competitions as unreliable, then people are not going to be as interested. TV revenue is not going to flow at the same level. You know, one of the things Dr. Bonner was talking about was football in this country. Now, football in this country is incredibly rich, and yet if you look at the number of tests on footballers in a season, it works out to be just over 1 per player a season. And I can see that UCAD don't have the resources to do that. On the other hand, well, there's no doubt that the Premiership League clubs do have the resources to do that. And I think on the whole, the attitude though tends to be that they don't want this to come out because all it does is tarnish their sport. And therefore, I think there has to be a kind of sea change.
And they know the problem's so big they can't solve it.
Sorry?
And they know the problem is so big that it's not easy to solve as well. Once you expose it, there's not a ready answer to it.
And I think for the anti-doping bodies, they do recognise that the problem is so big that they find it very hard to solve.
Yeah. As far as presumably, Dan Stevens, looking across sport, the motivation of a 35-year-old footballer to use doping to sustain their career will be the same for any other sportsman.
Yeah, great. And I think a lot of this does come down to money, and also how the anti-doping body, like UCAD, for example, use the money. From my point of view, I litigated this through the courts and I tried to defend my position, and I spent quite a lot of money doing that. I think UCAD outsourced all of their legal work to Bird & Bird. I think the estimated cost of that is potentially £50,000. So when UCAD say about lack of funding, the question remains that could you have spent £50,000 investigating the doctor, or should you have spent the £50,000 saying that you'd done a thorough investigation of the doctor to stop the athlete receiving a reduction in their sanction who gave you that information in the first place? So my view is that they could have investigated that doctor for a couple of £1,000, but yet they chose to spend circa £50,000 saying that they had investigated the doctor, and there's nothing to see there and the information was of little use. So that £50,000, if a test for EPO is £500, how many tests for EPO could you have run on athletes for? Yeah. So there's you know, how much of their UCAD's funding is being spent on litigating situations like this, and this is one of few that we know about, and I may be one of a handful of athletes that will actually try and take it this far. But it does raise questions about how the funding is being used and how much is being outsourced to the likes of Bird & Bird to deal with a case like mine.
Yeah.
And that's a big concern for me. Just as a taxpayer as well, it's a concern.
Thank you.
Thanks. Of course, we understand the desire on your side to tell the facts of your story, Mr. Stevens. We're obviously looking at the slightly more general implications in particular. Just to pick up on a couple of things there, Mr. Calvert, you seem to be suggesting that the level of under-testing in the Premiership was so bad that the Premiership itself should be funding a much more serious effort. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And if you, Dr. Bonner was the one who told us that there was hardly any testing in football. And if you look at the figures, there's something like 700 tests on footballers, and there's something like 600 footballers in the Premiership alone because of the big squads, which actually works out to be just more than one test per season. And that, in fact, is up dramatically from about 2-3 seasons ago when it was about 300 tests. And so, therefore, and then you've got to ask yourself, well, if you're going to have proper doping, who's going to pay for it? Is the government going to pay for it by funding UCAD more, or should the clubs who are tremendously wealthy and do say that they're anti-doping take that up themselves?
And whose stock market valuations and public reputation relies on the perception of a clean sport.
Exactly,
Okay,
yes.
That's helpful, thank you. Just a question or two for you, Mr. Stevens. How much does a course of EPO actually cost?
It's about £60, £50 to £60 a shot, but that's from a NHS pharmacy. Right?
And how many would you need to notice an effect?
1 a week. I
Over-
wasn't microdosing it. It
Over
was
a
just
period
one
of-
subcutaneous shot a week,
Over a period of
an ongoing period.
2 or 3 months.
Yeah, the normal protocol would be a higher dosage,
Right.
which is no more or less expensive than a lower dosage.
Just to be clear, £60 a week is a kind of £60 to £100 a week is the kind of amount of money.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly cheap. I mean, you've got to be putting serious money into.
Yeah, it's the price of a meal out.
Okay.
You know, it's no more expensive than that. So
No, but it's a deliberate decision. It's a financial decision. It's not as well as a moral and prudential decision. Okay, thank you. Am I right in thinking cycling records are still being set in areas like time trials and things like that?
yeah.
So how is that possible when doping's been eliminated?
I don't know. I think we're talking about EPO, and EPO was come to market in 2000. We're in 2016 now.
So we're in the post-EPO era, it turns out the records are still being broken.
I think there's substances like beloranib that's been running clinical trials at the moment. I think there's substances like ITPP, which is being used in horse racing. There's substances like GW1516, ACAR. You know, there's a number of new substances that could potentially be undetectable and be...
This is closer to the cutting edge of current doping.
And they could be used on top of EPO, as well as EPO, or to mask EPO. So, you know, we're talking about a product that's been well documented by, you know, lots of athletes who are competing in the, you know, Lance Armstrong period.
Right.
But obviously, we're now a long way down the line.
The EPO is the Ford Fiesta, and what you're saying is some people are driving Ferraris.
I think EPO's been on the market for a very long time. I think you know, anyone that would read medical documents would see there's a whole raft of products that could improve your performance. I know Wilder have recently banned xenon gas, but apparently it's undetectable at the moment. So I think we're a long way behind what the athletes could be using at an elite level. So I think where we're talking about at an amateur level, the amateurs are potentially using what the elites were using 15 years ago. You know, the elites could be using far more sophisticated stuff.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you, John Nicholson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Could I begin by asking, have the drugs done you any physical harm?
No.
No. And you wouldn't expect that they would do you physical harm?
No, but no negative health effects at all.
Is it possible it takes a period of time before we know what the long-term health disadvantages are?
No.
So you're confident that there is no long-term problem. I was very struck, Mr. Calvert, by just how blasé this doctor seemed to be.
Yes, he was quite open. I mean, it was as if he knew he could get away with it and didn't care.
Because I'm also a journalist by profession, and I've done sting operations, and quite often you feel that people are a little bit suspicious, and you've got to do a reasonably good job to try and allay their fears that you are exactly who you are pretending to be, in order to encourage them to open up. But this guy was just blabbing, wasn't he?
Well, I mean, we sent in this 23-year-old who said hardly anything about what, other than what his symptoms were, and he immediately started telling him that he'd treated athletes with performance-enhancing drugs in the past, and he could do so for him. Yeah, incredibly open, which again is suggestive of the fact that he had done this before, and he just saw it as normal.
Well, he'd good cause to feel relatively relaxed, didn't he? Because I was very struck, Mr. Stevens, by your evidence earlier on, where you said that notice to test had been posted on Twitter. Now, I wonder if we can return to that. Do you believe that the governing body was trying to alert athletes to the fact that a test was coming up?
I can't really comment on what the motives were for UKAD in posting that.
Speculate freely. What do you think they were up to?
It would suggest that there was a desire to not catch an athlete who was competing at that event by giving them advance notice that they would be testing.
Despite the fact that they say in public that they want to catch athletes, you believe that they don't want to catch athletes?
I think the common sense approach would be that if you are trying to catch athletes who are using substances that could clear the body within a matter of 24 hours, it wouldn't make sense to provide advance notice that you were going to be testing an event in 2 days' time.
Obviously. So what is their motivation? Why do they not want to catch athletes?
I don't know.
What do you think?
I'd rather not comment on that.
Well, you should feel free to comment. That's the purpose of
The
being here.
feeling I had.
You're in Parliament, you can say what you like.
The feeling that I had in my time that I was dealing with UCAD was that A, there was an endemic problem, B, that needs to be investigated, and C, there was a general lack of desire to investigate that. And that was my feeling, that there wasn't a desire to go after these athletes.
But there's a difference between just being a bit lazy about not catching people because we can't really be bothered, it's expensive to organise and time consuming, and actually alerting people of what you plan to do. That takes it to a different level.
Agreed.
Could the problem be corruption?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah. And the comment that I struggle with and still struggle with today is that, you know, the head of legal for UCAD claims that a doctor prescribing EPO is of little to no use to them. You know, and that's my biggest concern with UCAD as an organisation. It cannot be possible for a national anti-doping body to not view a British doctor prescribing athletes EPO as anything other than useful.
So are you saying that the reason that an alert was given on Twitter to athletes telling them not to take drugs because they were about to be tested is because backhanders were being given to the officials and governing body that was doing the testing?
No, I'm not saying backhand is given. I think there's
Front-handers?
Certainly a situation where some
Piles
sports,
of cash,
pardon?
openly?
No. I believe that there's a desire for, you know, some sports to not come under too much scrutiny where there may be a large-scale doping problem.
So I'm trying to find out exactly what you mean by corruption. So what inducements are the testers being given not to test?
I don't know. I have no idea.
What do you suspect?
I have no idea.
Well, what could it be? I mean, what seduces folk to persuade them not to do their job properly? It's either cash or benefits. What is it?
Bad PR?
Well, that's a bit wet, isn't it? I mean, really, they would let people know that they were going to test them for drugs because they're worried that there'd be bad PR.
Potentially, yeah. I can't comment and won't comment on that. It's not my position to do that either.
But
I can only share my experiences.
But you don't think it's about
at the time.
You don't think it's about cash benefits?
I have no idea, and I think that's why we're in this forum now, to try and look at ways of investigating what the problems are and what the motives are behind those people that are posting messages on Twitter that they're going to be testing at an event in 2 days' time. You know, as far as I'm concerned, I've raised it as an issue, and I was, you know, I think it needs to be looked at in more detail. I can't answer your question, and I think that's for, you know, perhaps another conversation that may come out of an investigation into why those kind of messages are being posted on Twitter.
Do you know of cyclists who've been given cash inducements to underperform?
No.
Mr. Calvert, you're looking a bit quizzical in this. Do you accept Mr. Stevens' characterisation of the sport as possibly corrupt?
Well, it could possibly be corrupt, but obviously you can only work on evidence, and I've not seen that evidence against UCAD. We certainly know that about the IAAF and the Russians. I mean, it's currently being investigated by the French
Indeed
police.
we do. So what do you think could possibly be the explanation for posting on Twitter that a drugs test will take place at a certain event?
I think in general there's a kind of coziness between the sport. So UCAD almost think they're part of the sport. And I seem to remember when we did the doping scandal story, there was an email from the head of UCAD saying in terms, you know, let's get this nasty mess out of the way, and so we can have a great Rio Olympics for the British team. Which was disclosed on FOI. I think in particular on this, my guess is that they will say that they do testing surprise testing, but they also warn at times, because it's kind of cost effective to say, don't dare dope here, because we're going to warn you in advance.
A combination, surprise testing with advance notice on Twitter.
Well, yes. I mean, they will do surprise testing as well, and they will also. I'm not here to speak for UCAD, but it does seem to me a pointless thing to do, is to give advance notice on.
Were they trying to warn any specific athlete, do you think?
Is that a question?
I don't know. I think that's probably a question that UCAD knows to answer.
We'll ask them as well, but while you're here, we'll ask you questions.
I think from my point of view, it's a matter of evidence, isn't it? And I can't comment on your question without knowing the inner workings of UCAD.
It is bizarre, though, isn't it, Mr. Culvert, that the sport should rely so heavily on journalists and journalism. I mean, without you and people like you, the evidence that we're getting in this committee is that the widespread use of drugs would go uncovered.
I think that's certainly been the case over the last 2 years. I mean, I think to a certain extent there is a kind of vested interest. Say if you're the IAAF in running your world championships, you don't want people to think that that your sport is riddled with drugs, and so therefore the drugs problem for the many members of the IAAF is not the biggest issue. So it took, say, our friend and colleague Hayo Sapalt, the German documentary team, to reveal the extent of Russian doping, which had to be known over a number of years. If you'd asked any athlete, they would have had great suspicions about Russian doping. But it was only when
Sebastian Coe, who knew nothing about it at all.
No, well, he didn't know. That's true. So it took that to then suddenly, and now Russia, they'll decide later this week as to whether Russia will be allowed to compete in the Olympics. And I think there is an element to which that our criticism of UCAD would be that they didn't investigate this particular case properly. If you look at the 3 interviews with Dan, they wander all over the place. They just do not drill down on what clearly could be proved, and you have to question their investigative competence.
Finally, UCAD's statement, they say that the media is invaluable in the fight against doping. Do you think they mean that? Do they like you? Are they glad you're doing what you're doing?
I don't know. I don't know whether they like us or not.
Are you greeted warmly when you meet them?
Sorry?
Are you greeted warmly when you meet them?
We are, and we have been trying to build bridges with them again after we were so critical of them, because we can see that we will pick up certain information that they will not have, and we would like to be able to pass it on to them so they could investigate it properly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. We need to keep moving. Chris Matheson.
No,
You're most kind. Thank you. We're running slightly late. I'm very
Speaker.
grateful to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. If I think, Mr. Stevens, about the recent history of cycling, from the Lance Armstrong scandal through to the Sir Dave Brailsford zero tolerance policy and people getting sacked from UK cycling for dealing with drugs 5 or 10 years previously, I have an entirely different picture from the one that you're painting of a sport that is still riddled with doping. How's that?
That's the question I think we've been trying to ask as well. It's, I think, public opinion and what maybe is going on behind closed doors may be conflicted. My view is very much that there is a fairly obvious problem. It needs to be dealt with. I gave them information to, allow them to deal with it, and it was not dealt with.
What level do you cycle at? You're an amateur, but a high-quality amateur, is that correct?
Yeah, a good amateur level is the level I was competing at. And I was doing 8-9 hours training a week, fitting that in between, family and work, children, etc. And there's lots of people who are competing at a very high level who are, maybe only doing 9 to 10 hours training a week.
Is it at all possible that the efforts that have been made at elite level simply haven't filtered down to the serious high-level amateur competition?
I don't really know. It's quite a hard question to answer. Like, obviously, one thing we haven't discussed is that I met with the Cycling Independent Reform Commission, and they were the people that gave me the reduction. And the information I gave to you guys is very similar to the information that the CERC were given. Obviously, I had issues that were raised. And I've got no idea what the CERC have done off the back of the investigation and how the information has been used.
You've both been very clear in your evidence that UCAD lacked the will to investigate. I wonder if that is promoted by the fact that they are, and I'm thinking out aloud here, but Mr. Calvert as well, you might wish to answer this, that UCAD's lacking of will is because they lack resources and want to focus those on elite levels where, frankly, most of the spotlight is. They simply haven't got the resources to deal with cycling at your level.
I think resources come at a cost, and I think the main concern for me around costs is the amount of money that was spent in litigation, claiming that the information I provided had been followed up and there wasn't any use to them, and if it had been of use they would have done more on it, etc., etc. The simple point that it clearly should have been of use, and the money they spent on litigating my appeal could have very easily been redirected in terms of more testing and looking at trying to catch the doctor, for example. And that's the concern for me is that the money is there, and the money was being used on litigation when it could have been used on actually doing a thorough investigation of the athlete. I've got no idea what the time spent on their investigation, but it certainly was a lot lower than the amount of money Bird & Bird would have been charging UCAD, and Bird & Bird are an expensive law firm.
And Mr. Calvert, is there a focus perhaps at UCAD on elite sport and not at the next few levels down?
I would imagine that they do, yes, would always do, but I think generally they probably are unresourced, and I don't think they put enough into their intelligence department. What they tend to do is, they, as far as I can see, they hire ex-policemen who talk about national intelligence models. I don't know what they are, but they're some sort of system they use for assessing the evidence. And they just do not have the powers. So if, say with this particular case, what do you need to do? You need to go in and seize the doctor's computers and see his medical notes. They don't have the powers to do this. So they have ex-policemen who are kind of grew up in that investigatory environment who are robbed of all the powers, which is why one of the proposals we're quite behind is to criminalise doping, because we think that would give a proper investigative authority the powers to go after the cheats, as well as, of course, also acting as a deterrent to athletes. Because, say, for example, in athletics at the moment, you get suspended for 2 to 4 years, which is absolutely nothing. I mean, it really is. If you get suspended for 2 years, then you could be going between the World Championships, but you could still be. You have your 2-year suspension. You'll be at the Olympics in 3 years' time because it's just a tiny sanction, and both the and quite a lot of the bodies in Britain have been very against extending those bans. They argue that they're legally complicated, but other sports don't find it so. So, we are, as you probably know, have done a lot of work on FIFA, and FIFA bans many of their people for life. And I think it's perfectly possible, just as you can be banned from, being a lawyer or being a doctor, to ban athletes for life. And I think they should do that. But above that, I think we also feel that criminalisation should be brought in, which is true of several other countries already. I mean, so Germany, Italy have introduced doping laws. Kenya have just done it. Even the Russians are about to do it. And I think, given that there is this arms race between the scientists and the athletes, and the athletes are winning, I think it needs radical measures like that.
Okay, and keeping to my promise to be brief for the chairman, let me ask you one further question, Mr. Stevens. You found Dr. Bonnar on Google, and obviously, Mr. Calvert, you have focused your investigations, well, given the apparent abundance of evidence on this one physician. Is there any evidence that you can find other doctors doing exactly the same thing on Google? And
Yeah, I think there's a number of anti-aging doctors.
And Mr. Calvert, have you found any? Sorry, Karen.
No, sorry. I think from my point of view, there's a number of anti-aging doctors in the UK that are advertising the fact that they will prescribe human growth hormone, testosterone for anti-aging reasons. I think if you was an athlete looking to buy doping products, that would be your first port of call. And I think the other thing, moving on from that, is that if you look at any bodybuilding forum, you can find plenty of information on doping and athletes openly sharing tips on how to make products work, or stack one agent with another agent to get a bigger effect, and how to cycle on and off the products. And it's all over the internet. This is an endemic problem, and it's potentially a lifestyle problem as much as a sporting problem.
And Dr. Boner did actually name another doctor himself, and we did go to him undercover as well, but for whatever reason that he wasn't willing to prescribe performance-enhancing drugs.
Thank you, Chair.
That's very interesting. Just a final point with you, Mr. Stevens. Obviously, you had a different experience with the Cycling Independent Reform Commission from the one you had with UKAD. Can you just very briefly, first of all, did they protect your anonymity?
Yeah.
So how did your anonymity get broken?
They asked whether I would agree for my name to be listed in the report.
CIRC did?
Yeah, and I agreed.
And you agreed. So that was waived with your permission and approval?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you just briefly compare what the experience you had with them was from the experience you had with UKAD?
The CIRC were a completely different organisation. I dealt with them through UK lawyers. And they generally just seem to be more concerned about what the bigger picture is and the causation behind that, and where that starts as well, and at what level that starts, and whether it's limited to the elite level or whether it's limited to all levels as such. That was the
more hands-on, more engaged, more professional.
Yeah, and I think if you read the CIRC report, there's a chapter on doping on various levels, certainly in age group competition as well. But again, it comes down to resources and how money is being distributed, how it's been sourced, and obviously how it's been policed as well, and how that money is being used within an organisation.
So it's made a pretty serious commitment to try to clean up.
I think out of all sports and all bodies managing sports, the UCI should be applauded more than anyone else, because cycling has always come under criticism for doping. I think the Festina affair, the Armstrong affair is fairly evident that there has been a large-scale doping problem in cycling. But I think the perception of that is larger and more prominent because of the work the UCI has done to try and clean up the problem. I think the UCI have been fairly open that there is a problem and that needs to be dealt with. And I think other sports should follow suit. There's clearly, while this has been going on with cycling, there's clearly been big problems within the IAAF. And the UCI have been more open than those guys in dealing with it. So I think, the UCI have done a very good job.
Yes. So they've taken the issue relatively more seriously, although from what you've previously said, you still regard doping with these new substances as endemic in cycling.
Endemic in sport.
In sport.
Football, boxing, athletics, and cycling is just another sport.
Right.
I think it's fairly clear that the UCI are doing everything they can to, deter and prevent and detect doping in sport, and that work obviously continues. But they need the support of people at UK that are doing a thorough job, and a UK doctor prescribing EPO could potentially be dealing with cyclists. He could be dealing with marathon runners. He could be dealing with footballers. He could be dealing with boxers. And the list is endless.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, both of you gentlemen. It's been an extremely helpful session. I'm sorry we've overrun. We're very grateful to you for your testimony.
No problem. Thank you.
Get the next witness.